The morning after the Hartwell Autumn Assembly, 3 of the younger ladies were still laughing about her over their chocolate, and the sound carried through the open door of the breakfast room, where Margaret Ainsley stood arranging the last of the season's dried hydrangeas in a bowl no one would notice. She was 8 and 20. She had been to 11 assemblies that year and had danced at 4 of them, always with widowers past 50 or with boys too shy to have chosen anyone else, and last night she had danced not at all. She had sat with the chaperones against the far wall, in the gray gown that had been remade twice, and she had watched the candlelight move across the ballroom floor, as though the light itself had somewhere better to be. Now the laughter reached her through the door, and she did not flinch, because she had trained herself years ago not to flinch, and she pressed a bruised stem flat against the rim of the bowl, and let the voices come. "The Spinster of Hartwell," one of them said, and the others took it up like a tune they already knew. Poor creature. She arranges the flowers and pours the tea, and she will do it until she is 50. And then she will do it for someone else's children. They were not cruel girls, exactly. They were girls who had been told their whole lives that a woman's worth expired on a schedule, and Margaret had simply passed the date printed on her. And so she had become a lesson the younger ones could point to. She set the bowl on the sideboard. She smoothed her cuffs. What none of them knew, and what she had told no one, was that a letter had come for her the previous week, sealed in gray wax with a crest she did not recognize, and that she had read it 4 times and burned it, and that she had not slept properly since. You may think you already know how this story goes, the plain woman and the great house and the long defeat of it. Stay with me. It does not go the way the room decided. Margaret's father had been a country clergyman with more books than income, and he had raised her on Latin and long walks and the conviction that a mind was not a thing that spoiled with age. He had died when she was 3 and 20, and the living had passed to a younger man, and Margaret had gone to keep house for her mother's cousin, Mrs. Fenwick of Hartwell, who was generous in the way that people are generous when they wish to be seen being generous. Margaret was given a small room above the pantry, and the running of the household and the understanding, never spoken but perfectly clear, that she was to be useful and grateful and quiet, and that the assemblies she was permitted to attend were a kindness she had aged out of deserving. She had accepted all of it. She had told herself that acceptance was a kind of strength. Some mornings she almost believed it. The house that pressed hardest against Hartwell was Ravensworth, the seat of the Viscount, whose lands ran along the river for 4 miles and whose gates most of the county had never passed through. The old Viscount had died 2 winters ago. His son had come back from the war to inherit, and in the 18 months since he had been seen perhaps a dozen times, at church, at the edge of a hunt. Once at an assembly he left before the second set. Nathaniel Ravensworth was 4 and 30, and he did not dance, and he did not call, and he did not, so far as anyone could tell, intend to marry. And the mothers of the county had first schemed over him, and then, defeated by his stillness, turned their schemes elsewhere. He was said to be cold. He was said to be proud. He stood at the backs of rooms with his hands behind him, and his jaw set like something carved, and he watched and he said little. And people found the watching easier to resent than to understand. Margaret had spoken to him exactly once. It had been at the assembly 3 weeks past, in the crush by the refreshment table, when a footman had stumbled and a tray of glasses had gone toward a child, one of the Fenwick grandchildren, a small girl of 6 who had wandered where she ought not. Margaret had moved without thinking. She had put herself between the child and the falling glass, taken the shatter of it against her own forearm, drawn the girl back by the shoulders and turned her face away, and she had done it so quickly and so quietly that most of the room never knew it had happened. Only afterward, in the corridor, binding her arm with a handkerchief, had she looked up to find the Viscount standing in the doorway, having seen the whole of it, saying nothing, his gray eyes fixed on her with an attention she did not know how to read. He had asked if she was hurt. She had said she was not. He had looked at the blood coming through the linen and said, his voice low, "Sit down." She had sat. He had sent for water and for the child's nurse, and he had stood over her while it was cleaned, and he had not spoken again, and when it was done he had bowed and gone, and Margaret had thought no more of it than that a great man had been, briefly, distantly, correct. She had not connected it to the letter. She had not let herself. The letter had said very little. It had given a date, which was tomorrow, and an hour, which was dawn. And it had said that a carriage would come to the Hartwell gate, and that she was asked, if she were willing, to be in it. It had been signed with a single initial. It had not explained itself. A sensible woman burns such a letter, and Margaret had burned it, and a sensible woman does not think of it again, and Margaret had thought of nothing else. She had told herself it was a mistake, a wrong direction, a cruelty even, some prank of the younger ladies who had learned somehow of her father's foolish faith that she was worth more than the county had priced her at. She had decided she would not go. She had decided it a dozen times, and each time the deciding had cost her more, and now it was the morning before, and the flowers were arranged, and the girls were laughing over their chocolate, and Margaret stood very still and understood that she had not decided anything at all. That afternoon, a child came to find her. It was the same small girl from the assembly, Clara, the Fenwick grandchild, who had attached herself to Margaret in the week since with the fierce, unreasoning loyalty of the very young. Clara had a habit of appearing at Margaret's elbow with a book, too difficult for her, and a demand that it be read. This afternoon the book was one of Margaret's father's, a battered volume of voyages, and Margaret took the child up to the window seat above the pantry, and read to her about ice and whales and the long dark of the northern winter, and Clara leaned into her side and was warm. And for an hour Margaret forgot the letter and the laughter and the gray gown remade twice. When the light began to go, Clara looked up at her and said with the awful directness of 6 years old, "Why does nobody marry you? You are the nicest one." Margaret laughed, because it was that or the other thing, and she said that some people were made to be aunts, and that being an aunt was a very good thing to be, and Clara considered this, and found it insufficient and said so. Margaret held her a little closer and did not answer, and outside the window, the last of the daylight went gray, and then went out. There was a servant at Ravensworth who knew Margaret slightly, an under-gardener named Tom, whose mother had been nursed by Margaret's father in her last illness and never charged for it. Tom came to the kitchen door at Hartwell now, and then with a basket of the estate's pears, ostensibly for Mrs. Fenwick, actually for Margaret, and he lingered by the step and talked. It was Tom, that evening, without knowing what he told her, who gave Margaret the shape of the man she had refused to think about. He told her that the Viscount rose before the household, and rode the far fields alone in every weather. He told her that there was a nursery at Ravensworth that had been shut since before the old Viscount died, and that the new one had ordered it opened and aired, and then had never gone into it. He told her that his lordship kept a small portrait in his breast pocket, and took it out sometimes at the end of a long day, and looked at it and put it away, and that no one knew whose face it was, and that a footman who had asked had been dismissed. Margaret listened and said nothing, and gave Tom a jar of her quince preserve for his mother, and after he had gone she stood in the cold kitchen a long time, with her hand pressed flat against her own breastbone, as though she could feel through it the shape of a portrait she had never seen. She did not sleep. She lay in the small room above the pantry and watched the square of window go from black to a lightless gray, and somewhere below, in the great silence of the house, a clock struck the hour she was not sleeping through, and she thought about her father, who had believed she was worth the whole world. She thought about the girls and their chocolate. She thought about the word spinster, how it had been a working word once, a woman who spun, a woman whose hands made a thing of use, and how the county had turned it into a verdict. And she thought about the letter she had burned, the gray wax, the single hour named, and she found that at some point in the long night, without any moment she could point to, she had stopped deciding not to go. Before the first true light, Margaret rose. She washed in cold water, and dressed in the gray gown, because it was the best she had, and she pinned up her dark hair with the plain combs that had been her mother's, and she took her mother's shawl from the peg, and put it around her shoulders. And she went down through the sleeping house and out the side door into the dark. The morning was cold and still, and the sky above the eastern hills had begun, very faintly, to pale. She walked down the drive to the Hartwell gate. She did not know if anything would come. She had prepared herself all night for nothing to come, for the long walk back and the rest of her life understood. She stood at the gate with her hands folded and her breath showing white in the gray air, and she waited. The carriage came out of the last of the dark, like a thing arriving from another life. She heard it first, the wheels and the horses on the frost-hard road, and then she saw the lamps, 2 points of gold swaying toward her, and then the whole of it, black and polished with a crest on the door she had seen only once before on a letter she had burned. It drew up at the gate. A footman came down and opened the door, and let down the step, and stood waiting, his face carefully, without expression, and inside the carriage there was no one. Margaret stood at the open door and looked into the empty dark of it and understood that she was being asked to get in alone and be carried she knew not where, on the word of a man she had spoken to once, and that every rule she had been raised inside told her to turn and walk back up the drive. Her heart was going hard against her ribs. Her hand, when she put it on the frame of the door, was not quite steady. She got in. The footman folded the step and closed the door, and the carriage moved, and Margaret sat in the dark with her hands folded in her lap and watched the pale country go by the window, and did not know she had been holding her breath until the gates of Ravensworth opened ahead of them and she let it go. The great house came up gray and vast in the dawn, and the carriage did not stop at the front, but went round to a side entrance where a single door stood open with warm light behind it. The footman handed her down. A housekeeper in black received her, an older woman with a kind and guarded face, and said only, "This way, miss," and led her not through staterooms, but up a plain stair, and along a passage to a door the housekeeper opened and did not enter. "He asked that you be brought here," the woman said, and something in her voice was careful, as though she were handling a thing she did not fully understand. And then she was gone, and Margaret stood on the threshold of a room she had not expected and understood nothing. It was the nursery. The shut nursery, opened and aired, the one Tom had spoken of. There was a low fire in the grate, and gray light coming through tall windows and a rocking horse in the corner, with its paint gone soft with age, and there were shelves of children's books, and a child's small chair and a cradle standing empty by the wall. And by the window, with his back to her and his hands behind him, stood the Viscount of Ravensworth, and he did not turn at once, and when he did, his face in the gray light was not cold at all. It was the face of a man who had not slept. "Either, Miss Ainsley," he said. "Thank you for coming. I did not think you would." Margaret found that she could not speak at once. She stood just inside the door of the nursery with her mother's shawl about her shoulders and the empty cradle at the edge of her sight. And she looked at the Viscount, and every explanation she had rehearsed in the long night fell away from her as insufficient. "My lord," she said finally, "I do not understand why I am here. It was the truth." And she had promised herself that if nothing else, she would tell the truth in this house, whatever the cost of it. He did not answer directly. He crossed to the small chair by the fire and stood beside it, and did not sit, and he said, looking, not at her but into the low flames, "3 weeks ago, you put yourself between a falling tray and a child who was not yours, and you took the harm of it. And you bound your own arm in a corridor and went back into the room as though nothing had happened." He turned then and looked at her. "I have not been able to stop thinking of it. Not the act, the manner of it. You did not look to see who was watching. There was no one you performed it for." He paused, and something in his jaw worked, and he mastered it. "I have spent 18 months among people who do nothing that is not performed. I had begun to think there was no other kind of person left." The fire settled. Somewhere below in the great house, a door opened and closed. Margaret stood very still. "I asked about you," he went on more quietly. "I know that was not my right. I know what the county says of you. I know the word they use. He said it without cruelty, but he said it, because it was between them, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. They call you the Spinster of Hartwell, and they mean by it that you are finished, that you are a thing set aside. His gray eyes did not leave her face. I have found, in the asking, that everything they mean by the word is false. You read to a child who is not yours. You gave your last preserve to a gardener's sick mother. You keep a house that gives you nothing, and you keep it well, and you do not complain of it, and you do not, so far as I can discover, hate anyone. He stopped. I did not know how to say any of this in a drawing room, with the county watching, turning it into a story before it had happened. So I sent a carriage at an hour when no one would see it, to a woman I hoped was brave enough to come. I see that I was not wrong about the courage. Margaret's hand had risen to the shawl at her throat. She was aware of her own heartbeat, loud and unruly, and of the gray light, and of the empty cradle she would not look at, and she understood that whatever was happening in this room was not a cruelty, and not a prank, and not a mistake, and that this understanding frightened her far more than any of those would have. "My lord," she said, and her voice was not steady, "why this room?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his breast pocket and took out a small portrait in a worn frame, the portrait Tom had spoken of. And he looked at it, and he crossed the room and held it out to her. And Margaret took it in both hands. It was the likeness of a young woman with a gentle, laughing face. "My sister," he said. "Eleanor. She was married to a man who did not deserve her, and she died 4 years ago bearing his child. And the child did not live either, and I was in Spain and did not come home in time to see either of them." His voice was level, which was worse than if it had broken. This was to have been their nursery. My father shut it. I opened it because I could not bear that it should stay shut, and then I could not bring myself to come into it because it was full of what did not happen. He looked at the empty cradle. I have made this house a monument to that. 18 months. I have let it stand as a shut door with a grieving man behind it, and I have called that grief, and it was not grief, it was fear. I was afraid to want a living thing again. Margaret held the portrait of Eleanor, and did not know she was weeping, until she felt it on her face. You have perhaps been waiting all this while, for the moment the cold man's coldness would be explained. Here it is. It was never coldness. It was a shut nursery, and a portrait taken out at the end of long days. I only ask you to remember, when the county speaks of him later, that they never once ask. "I do not know how to court a woman," the Viscount said, and there was in his voice now the barest edge of something that in another man might have been humor, offered like a hand across a gap. "I have watched other men do it, and I find the whole apparatus false. So I will not do it. I will tell you instead what I want plainly, and you may do with it as you choose." He took a breath. "I want to open the shut rooms of this house. I want to stop being a monument. I want to sit across a table from someone who does not perform, and grow old doing it. And I have looked at every unmarried woman the county put in front of me, and felt nothing but the wish to leave the room. And then I saw a woman bind her own arm in a corridor and go back in without a word. And I have felt, since that night, something I had thought was gone." He stopped. "That is want, Miss Ainsley. Not duty and not pity. I am telling you that I want you, and that I know how the world has priced you, and that the world is a fool." The nursery was very quiet. The fire moved. Margaret set the portrait of Eleanor gently on the mantel, and stood with her back half to him, because she could not look at him and say what she had to say. "You have been kind to me in a room where no one can see it," she said. "You have opened a shut door for me. I am grateful, and I am afraid. And both of those are true." She turned. "But I have been the invisible woman in this county for 5 years, my lord, and I have learned to live inside it, and I do not know how to be looked at. If you bring me into the light, they will not see the woman you have described. They will see a spinster who trapped a lonely lord in his grief, and they will make of me a thing to laugh at. And I have laughed alone in enough corridors Her voice did not break, but it came near. I could bear their verdict when I was nothing to them. I do not know if I could bear it as your wife. He crossed the room to her then, and he did not take her hands, though she saw that he wished to. Saw the hand rise and stop and lower again, a discipline that cost him. Then we will not do it in the dark, he said. You are afraid of their verdict. So am I. Differently. Let us have it out where they render it, and let it be answered there. Once, so that it is finished. There is the Ravensworth ball at the turn of the season, my mother's ball. Every family in the county comes to it, and my mother has spent a year arranging a marriage for me that I have not agreed to. To a young lady of great polish and no particular kindness, and the whole county has decided that match before I have spoken a word. His gray eyes held hers. Come to it, not as a servant of the Fenwicks as my guest, and I will answer their verdict in the room where they made it. Will you trust me that far? Margaret looked at the man who had sent a carriage for her at dawn rather than shame her in daylight, and she thought of her father, who had believed she was worth the world, and she found that after 5 years of enduring, she had, somewhere in the long night, become willing to do something braver than endure. Yes, she said, I will trust you that far. The weeks between were the strangest of Margaret's life, because outwardly nothing changed at all. She poured the tea and arranged the flowers, and read to Clara in the window seat, and the younger ladies laughed at her over their chocolate. And none of them knew that a carriage had come at dawn, or that a shut nursery had been opened, or that a Viscount had said the word "want" to a spinster in the grey light. Margaret carried it inside her like a coal. She was afraid to look at directly. Twice more the Viscount contrived to see her. Once when she was walking Clara along the river path and he was riding the far field, and turned his horse and came down to them, and dismounted, and walked with them a quarter mile, talking of ordinary things, of books and of the child's questions. And once at church, where he did nothing at all but catch her eye across the aisle and hold it a moment, and Margaret felt the look move through her like heat through cold water. And Mrs. Prur, Fenwick beside her, saw nothing, and the younger ladies saw nothing, and Margaret sat with her hands folded, and her heart going hard, and understood that the body knows a thing long before the mind will grant it permission. But the county was not blind forever, and the lever the hierarchy would pull had a name, and her name was the Dowager Viscountess, Nathaniel's mother, who had arranged a marriage her son had never agreed to, and who did not intend to be surprised in her own ballroom. It was the Dowager who first heard, through a maid who had seen a carriage at the Hartwell gate at dawn, that something was amiss. And it was the Dowager who summoned Margaret to Ravensworth, not to the nursery this time, but to a cold, formal morning room, 10 days before the ball, and received her seated, and did not offer her a chair. You are the Ainsley woman, the Dowager said, the one who keeps house for the Fenwicks. She was a handsome woman of 60, with her son's gray eyes, and none of his stillness, and she held a fan she did not need in a warm room. And she looked at Margaret the way one looks at a stain on a thing one owns. My son has taken a fancy to you. I am told he sent a carriage. I am told he showed you a room in this house that he has shown no one. Her fan moved once, sharply. I will speak plainly, since you are a sensible woman and past the age of illusions. My son is grieving and lonely and not himself, and grief makes men foolish, and you are exactly the kind of foolishness a grieving man reaches for, a plain, unthreatening woman who will be grateful and ask for nothing. It will pass. And when it passes, he will marry Miss Sophia Vane, whom I have chosen, and you will have been a spinster who overreached, and the whole county will know it. She let the word spinster sit in the air. I am giving you the chance to withdraw with your dignity. Do not come to my ball. Margaret stood in the cold morning room and understood that this was the moment the county's verdict was being handed to her formally, in the very house where she had been shown kindness, and she understood that everything she had spent 5 years learning to do was to bow her head and accept and be grateful and quiet. And she found that she would not. Madam, she said, and her voice was level, and it surprised them both. You have described a woman who reaches for a grieving man out of calculation. I have not reached for your son, He sent for me, and I very nearly did not come. And I told him to his face that I was afraid of exactly the verdict you are now delivering." She held the older woman's gray eyes, so like her son's, and so unlike. "I do not know if your son loves me. I know that he saw me clearly when no one else in this county troubled to look, and that this is a rarer thing than you appear to think. You have offered me my dignity if I stay away. I find I would rather keep it by coming." She inclined her head, correct to the last. "I will see you at the ball, madam." She walked out of Ravensworth with her spine straight and her hands steady, and she did not weep until she was well down the drive and out of sight, and then she wept from the sheer terror of what she had done, because she had just refused a dowager viscountess in her own house, and she had no illusions about what such women could do to a woman who had nothing. What the dowager did was worse than Margaret had imagined, because she did it in the open. In the 10 days before the ball, the story spread through the county. And it was not the true story. It was the dowager story, shaped and released with the skill of a woman who had governed a county's opinions for 40 years. The story was that the Ainsley spinster, the poor relation who kept the Fenwick's house, had thrown herself at the grieving Viscount, had contrived to be alone with him, had sunk so low as to trade on a lonely man's sorrow to raise herself above her station. The story was that she was to be pitied or despised, and the county could not quite decide which, and so did both. Mrs. Fenwick heard it, and was cold to Margaret for the shame it brought on her house. The younger ladies heard it, and their laughter over the chocolate took on a new and crueler edge, and one of them, meeting Margaret in the passage, did not trouble to lower her voice to her companion. "That is the one," she said. Reached above herself, and got caught at it. The spinster, who thought a viscount would have her. Margaret walked past them with the flowers in her hands and did not answer. And the water in the bowl trembled with the shaking she would not let reach her face. 3 nights before the ball, the worst thing happened, and it was Clara who brought it. The child came to the window seat, white-faced, and would not read, and when Margaret coaxed it out of her, it was this: that her grandmother, Mrs. Sad. Fenwick had said in the child's hearing that Miss Ainsley was to leave Hartwell after the ball, that a woman who brought scandal on a house could not stay in it, and that Clara was not to grow so fond of her, because Margaret would soon be gone. The child clung to her, and wept and asked if it was true, and Margaret, who had promised herself she would tell the truth in every house, found that she could not lie even now. She held the child and said that she did not know what would happen, and that whatever happened she would not stop loving her, and that some things a person must simply walk toward without knowing. And Clara did not understand and wept harder, and Margaret held her in the going light and understood that she had lost everything already, the house and the position and the child, and had gained nothing certain in its place but the word of a man at dawn. That was the dark of it. She lay again in the small room above the pantry, 3 nights before the ball. And she had never in 5 years of enduring felt so entirely without ground beneath her. If she went to the ball, she went into the dowager story, into a room arranged to destroy her, on the strength of a trust she had no proof would hold. If she did not go, she confirmed the story, and lost the man, and kept nothing, and left the county exactly the spinster it had priced her at, and lost the child besides. She thought of her father. She thought of the grey wax and the single hour. She thought of a man standing in a shut nursery saying the world is a fool, and she did not know, lying there in the dark, whether the world was the fool or whether she was for having believed him. The morning of the ball, a note came. It was in the same hand as the letter she had burned, and it said only this: "I have not changed. Come." And there was a small thing folded inside it, a pressed flower, a sprig of forget-me-not. Gone papery and blue, the kind that grew along the river path where he had walked with her and Clara, and Margaret held it in her palm a long time. It was not a grand thing. It was a small blue flower. A man had noticed and kept because she had touched it in passing on a walk. He had turned his horse to join. She pressed it flat between the pages of her father's book of voyages, next to the account of the long northern winter, and she dressed for the ball. She had no gown for it. She had the gray, remade twice, and she put it on, because a woman does not conjure silk from nothing, and she pinned her mother's combs in her dark hair and put her mother's shawl about her shoulders and looked at herself in the small glass and saw exactly the woman the county had described, a plain spinster past her season in a made-over gown. And she looted her chin and went down. She had told no one she was going. She walked out the side door of Hartwell in the early dark and down the drive to the gate, as she had once before. And the carriage was there again, black and polished with the crest on the door. And this time she did not hesitate at the step. She got in. She was carried through the dark to the great house, which stood ablaze this time with every window lit, and the sound of the orchestra came down to her across the frosted lawn, and Margaret sat in the dark of the carriage with the pressed flower's memory in her chest, and was more afraid than she had ever been in her life, and went in anyway. The ballroom of Ravensworth was the arena in which the county rendered its verdicts, and it was full. Candlelight moved across the high ceilings and the polished floor, and the terrace doors stood open to the cold night, and there were 200 people in it, every family of consequence in the county, in silk and diamonds, and at the head of the room in a great chair sat the Dowager Viscountess in gray and pearls with Miss Vane arranged at her right hand. A beautiful girl in ice blue with a face like a cool morning, the chosen match, the correct choice, waiting. And when Margaret Ainsley came through the doors in her twice-made gray gown with her mother's shawl about her shoulders, the room did not fall silent all at once. It fell silent the way a wave draws back from the doors outward, conversation stopping in widening rings as face after face turned and recognized her and understood what her presence meant, until the whole vast candlelit room stood still and staring, and the orchestra faltered and found its feet and played on into a silence that had swallowed it. Margaret stood just inside the doors. She had never in her life been looked at by so many people at once, and every rule she had been raised inside screamed at her to lower her eyes and shrink and apologize with her whole body for existing where she had been told not to. She did not lower her eyes. She had walked toward this without knowing, and now she was in it, and she stood with her chin level and her hands still and let them look, and across the vast room she found the Dowager's gray eyes, and did not look away from them, and the Dowager's fan had stopped moving. And then from the far side of the room, the Viscount of Ravensworth crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He came through the parting crowd in the candlelight with his hands at his sides, and his gray eyes fixed on Margaret, and on no one else, past his mother, past Miss Vane in her ice-blue silk, past every arranged and correct thing in the room, and the crowd drew back before him and turned to watch him come, and the silence held. He crossed the whole length of the ballroom to where Margaret stood in her twice-made gown, and he stopped before her, and in the sight of the entire county he bowed to her, low and deliberate. The bow a man makes to a woman he honors, and he straightened, and he offered her his hand. "You came," he said low for her. "You said you had not changed," she answered. He turned then, still holding her hand, and faced the room, and his mother, and the beautiful girl in ice blue, and every face that had priced Margaret and found her wanting. And he did not make a speech because he was not a man who made speeches, and the room waited. And into the great candlelit silence he said one thing only, plainly, so that every soul in that room heard it. "I am to marry Miss Ainsley." The silence after held for the length of a held breath. Then it broke, not into uproar, but into the low rushing murmur of 200 people rearranging in an instant everything they had believed, and at the head of the room the Dowager Viscountess rose half out of her great chair with her fan fallen from her hand, and her mouth moved and made no sound, and Miss Sophia Vane, who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, looked at the plain woman in gray, whom the Viscount had crossed a ballroom to claim, and something in the girl's cool face gave way, not to malice, but to a kind of dawning and bewildered understanding, as though she had glimpsed for the first time that the whole apparatus that had promised her this man had promised her something false. The Dowager found her voice. "Nathaniel," she said, and it came out cracked, stripped of 40 years of governance. You do not know what you do. The county will never receive her. You are throwing yourself away on a woman past her season with nothing to her name. Her son looked at his mother across the ballroom, and when he spoke, his voice was not cruel, and it was not loud, and it was the more terrible for being neither. She has to her name, he said, the fact that she is the only person in this county who has ever done a kind thing where no one could see it. You raised me to value blood and land and polish. I went to war and watched men with all three do nothing worth remembering. And I came home and found a woman with none of them bind her own arm in a corridor to spare a child a fright, and tell no one. He paused. You called her a spinster, madam. I have decided to call her my wife. The county may receive her, or it may not. I find I have stopped consulting the county. He did not humiliate her further. He might have. The room was his and the story had turned, and he could have broken his mother in front of all of them. And he did not, because that was not the calibrated thing. And Margaret, watching, understood that his restraint was itself a kind of mercy, that he was displacing his mother from her 40 years of governance, correcting rather than crushing. The dowager sank back into her chair. She had lost, and she knew it, and the county saw her know it, and it was enough. Then the Viscount turned back to Margaret, in the sight of them all, and he raised her gloved hand, and he did not kiss it, though everyone expected it. He held it, and he looked at her, and he said, Lo! The first time he had ever said it, Margaret, only her name. And in the saying of it, deliberate and marked before the whole county, that had never once used it kindly, was everything the room needed to understand, and everything she had waited 5 years to hear. And Margaret stood in the ruined silence of the dowager's ballroom, with her hand in his, and her name in his mouth, and understood that the verdict had been answered once, in the room where it was made, and that it was finished. The orchestra, which had never quite stopped, gathered itself and began a waltz, uncertain at first, and then sure, and the Viscount of Ravensworth led the Spinster of Hartwell out onto the floor of his mother's ballroom, and the county drew back and made a space for them, and they danced. Margaret had not danced at an assembly in more than a year. She had sat against the wall with the chaperones in the gray gown, and watched the candlelight move across a floor that had somewhere better to be. Now the floor was hers, and the candlelight moved across her, and the man who held her had crossed a room full of his own people to reach her, and she found, turning under the lights with 200 faces watching, that she was not afraid anymore. Somewhere among the watching faces, a few began, quietly to understand what they had missed, and to be ashamed of it, and the ones who understood soonest were the ones who had known her longest. They were married quietly in the spring, in the small church where Margaret's father had once had the living, with Clara scattering the last of the winter's dried petals down the aisle because there were no fresh ones yet, and the child had insisted on scattering something. Mrs. Fenwick came, and was gracious because the county had entirely reversed itself, and it was now a great thing to have housed the future Viscountess, and Margaret received her graciousness without comment, having learned long ago exactly what it was worth. The younger ladies came too, and did not laugh, and one of them, the one who had spoken cruelly in the passage, took Margaret's hand at the church door and said she was sorry, and Margaret, who had wept alone in enough corridors, forgave her, because a person who has been unseen for 5 years knows better than most that people are mostly only frightened, and cruelty is mostly only fear that has found something smaller than itself. The dowager did not come to the wedding. By Christmas, though, she had come to Ravensworth for the first dinner of the season, stiff and unforgiving, and had found her son happy in a way she had not seen him since before the war, and had found the plain daughter-in-law she despised holding a small nephew of the family on her knee in the drawing-room, and reading to him from a battered book of voyages, and had watched and said nothing, and gone home. She came again at the New Year, and again after that. Correction is slower than defeat, and the dowager was corrected slowly, and never quite apologized. and did in the end grow to sit in the room while Margaret read to the children, which for such a woman was as near to an apology as the world was going to get. The nursery at Ravensworth was no longer shut. Margaret had asked in the first week of her marriage whether they might keep Eleanor's portrait on the mantel there rather than in her husband's pocket, so that the room might hold the memory without being made a monument to it. And Nathaniel had looked at her a long moment, and then had taken the small, worn frame from his breast and set it on the mantel with his own hands, and had stood back and had let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 4 years. The room was full of children now. On most afternoons, the Fenwick grandchild, who had refused to stop loving Margaret, and the various small nephews and nieces of the great house, and the rocking horse with its soft paint, was ridden hard, and the shelves of children's books were pulled down and read and left open on the floor. And the room that had been full of what did not happen was slowly, ordinarily filled with what did. On a winter evening near the end of her first year as Viscountess, Margaret sat in the nursery with the fire low and snow beginning against the tall windows, and Clara was asleep against her side, too old for it now and doing it anyway. And Nathaniel came in from the cold fields and stood in the doorway and did not speak, watching them. On the mantel, Eleanor's gentle, laughing face caught the firelight. In the pages of a battered book of voyages, closed on the low table, a sprig of forget-me-not gone papery and blue lay pressed between the account of the northern winter and the next chapter, where it had been these many months and would stay. Margaret looked up and found her husband in the doorway watching her with the gray eyes that had seen her when no one else had troubled to look, and she did not say anything, and neither did he, and the snow came down soft against the glass, and the fire settled, and the shut door of the great house stood open now and would not shut again. If Margaret's story stayed with you, stay a moment more, and leave a word behind for the ones who were seen too late, and the ones who did the seeing. And thank you truly for staying to the end.